Okay, I want to welcome up everybody. My name is Larry Mayer, and I am the Applied Technology Counselor on the Oceanography Society Council. And my career has always been at the interface of science and technology, and I've often kind of entered into the debate about whether science spurs technical innovation or whether technical innovation drives the science. But the truth, of course, is that that both happen, and they both happen at the same time. And we really can't separate the science from the technical innovation. Yet sometimes the stovepipes we built in our institutions keep us apart. And so as we thought about new topics for seminars for the Oceanography Society, and we recognize that we have a wonderful group of corporate sponsors who are really at the leading edge of technological innovation. But we also recognize that you probably don't want to hear an hour-long advertisement from one of our corporate sponsors. We had the thought that bringing leading scientists to talk about their use of the technology, but at the same time have the corporate sponsor available to answer in-depth questions about technology might be an interesting thing to try. And that's how we've gotten to this Exploring Ocean Instrumentation webinar series, of which this is the first one, and we're quite excited about. And in that context, I'm delighted to introduce Travis Miles, who'll talk about his work on sediment resuspension observations from a glider-integrated Sequoia scientific list particle analyzer. Travis is an assistant professor in the Department of Marine and Coastal Sciences at Rutgers University in New Brunswick. That's where he also got his doctorate. He was a Fulbright scholar at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden and was the recipient of the 2019 Marine Technology Society Young Professional Award. He's a core faculty member within the Rutgers University Center for Ocean Observing Leadership. And he specializes in using networked ocean observation systems, including autonomous underwater robots, remote sensing technologies, and predictive ocean and atmosphere models to study air-sea interactions, ocean mixing, and sediment resuspension and transport in coastal storms. And I suspect that's what we're going to hear a lot about today. And with us from Sequoia, we have Wayne Slade from Sequoia Scientific. Wayne received an MS in electrical engineering in 2004, focused on signal and image processing and intelligent algorithm design, and a PhD in oceanography in 2011, focused on ocean particle optics, especially how sediment resuspension and particle dynamics affect inherent optical properties. He's been employed by Sequoia since 2011 as a scientist, and since 2019, he's been the VP for Science and Technology. He has experience in deploying optical sensors in coastal and open ocean environments, in design and execution of laboratory studies using optical instrumentation, and in computer modeling of the optical properties of particles. At Sequoia, he focuses on the development of new instrumentation and methods for measuring particle optical properties and the deployment of these technologies in observing systems, ship-based flow-through systems, and on autonomous and other challenging platforms. So I think we have a beautiful combination of expertise here. And then let me turn it over to Travis. Travis will give us about a 30-minute presentation. We'll open it up to questions then, to either Travis or to Wayne. You can use the question, raise your hand function, or you can use the chat function. Both Jenny and I'll keep track of that. Or if you really want, you can just unmute yourself and interrupt. But I do ask, if you can, keep yourself muted while Travis is talking. I see, Oli, do you have a question already? Is that your hand raised? No, oh no, it was actually my little cursor, which went into the shape of a hand, was right over your image. So my apologies for that. Let me just turn it over to Travis then, please. Travis, look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Yeah, thank you. And this is being recorded, and I think we're going to post it to YouTube afterwards. So for anyone watching, feel free to email me or Wayne with any questions after the fact, or anytime years from now when you see this. So thank you for the introduction, and it's my pleasure to be here. This is pretty exciting. This is the first talk I've given on this topic, on this particular work. We basically have a paper that we just did the proofs for that should be coming out within a week or two, open access on this topic. So it's a new talk. new slides. So some parts of it might be a little rough, but I think it's pretty exciting stuff, or at least I'm excited about it, and hopefully I can make you all excited about it as we go. As you can see, the talk's going to be about sediment resuspension from a list sensor, a Sequoia list sensor, integrated into, in this case, a Teledyne Web Slocum glider. You can see back behind me, I actually have one of the list sensors sitting behind me, which I'll reference. We have a few in the lab and are always looking for collaborations and people who want to install them on their gliders. So with that, I'll just jump right in. Let's see. Okay. So before I get into the list and sediment, I want to just introduce myself a little bit more. So I'm a faculty member at Rutgers University, which is in central New Jersey in the mid-Atlantic. This is a map of population density per square mile. This is not exactly the place I planned on being when I decided to be an oceanographer as a 18-year-old undergraduate. I was thinking I was going to be in the tropics and, working on dolphins and things like that. But I really, really enjoy being an oceanographer in this place and in this area, this very urbanized area where a lot of people in society meet with our coastal oceans. It's very rewarding work and it's very interesting work. So in our region, the mid-Atlantic, we have a quarter of the US population, a quarter of the US GDP, the largest Navy port, commercial ports, fishing fleets, and we have a burgeoning offshore wind energy industry. With those drivers, we have a lot of stressors. We have water quality issues, hurricane and winter storms, flooding, extreme and nuisance flooding. So storms like Hurricane Sandy, as well as the storms we've just gotten the last 2 weeks or so, which are just rainstorms. Hypoxia, intense multi-use waterways, and urbanized coasts. So with that environment and those challenges, we're always looking for new ways to monitor these processes and to try to solve some of these problems. So we're doing science for society. Where I work, this is the Center for Ocean Observing Leadership. It's been around for about 30 years. Its previous incarnation was the Coastal Ocean Observing Lab. So I'm one of five core faculty for that group. This is where we teach and where we study in the cool room with our students there. And as part of MARCUS, the regional association, the Mid-Atlantic Regional Association for Coastal Ocean Observing System, we operate lots of different ocean observing systems and numerical models. So we have satellite receivers where we still get direct downloads from satellites. We have over 46 CODAR sites measuring surface currents of the ocean every hour. We've carried out over 500 glider deployments, and this is really where my expertise lies. And we operate our own ocean and atmospheric modeling systems and work very closely with NOAA and our regional partners on those systems. All of this work requires partnership, and that's not just governmental partnership, but it's partnership with many different private companies. I mentioned CODAR, Teledyne Web is one of them, all the different funding agencies, and with Sequoia. We've been partnering with Sequoia in some incarnation in this region for a very long time, as I'll show actually some of that in the next slide. But our lab was actually really born, I like to say, in the dirt with sediment. This was work with Scott Glenn back in the 1990s, who was my PhD advisor, setting up the Leo 15 site. So this is the long-term ecosystem observatory site, was a cabled array off of Great Bay, New Jersey. So that's just off of Atlantic City, just northeast of Atlantic City. And at that site, basically there were a set of different moorings as well as a cabled array going back to a field station to send data back in real time. Sites like this were used to measure ocean optical properties, look at water quality, bottom boundary layer physics, ecosystem dynamics, and pollutant fate and effects. A lot of the funding came from the Navy back then. And these sites were really exciting to put put sensors onto these tripods or platforms or moorings and measure really high resolution temporal measurements of things like sediment resuspension and transport. Some of the challenges of a site like this was you had very limited spatial or vertical resolution. So you just have one location. If you have a lot of variability in processes to the north and south, you wouldn't capture that. Difficult sensor calibration. So you can get really good information near the bed with one sensor, but if you want to start moving up into the water column, you have to have multiple sensors and intercalibrate all of those sensors together, which can be very difficult. And in this case, we had the cabled array, but without the cable, which was a very expensive system to install and run, you have very little real-time data, which is more and more important as we move forward. So the next evolution of this, Scott Glenn and others in Are You Cool started to learn about gliders. So autonomous underwater vehicles to try to solve some of these problems, try to measure at high resolutions in the vertical, but also be able to make regional measurements and get data back to shore in real time and in extreme conditions without being out on a vessel. So one of the core technologies we use, as I mentioned, is the Slocum glider, specifically the shallow water coastal Slocum gliders. And these are basically, most people probably have heard about them, a little bit of details. They're basically autonomous vehicles that profile through the water column, collecting data about every 2 seconds and sending that data back to shore. So basically at the surface, they have a pump in the front end that will suck in a little bit of water, decrease its volume, and cause the glider to dive through the water column. And then when it gets to a pre-programmed depth or near the bottom with its altimeter, it pushes that water back out and it climbs back up through the water column. And it does that over and over and over again until it surfaces, acquires new GPS, sends its data back to shore, and gets any new commands. So that you basically get these data ribbons down below, which we'll be seeing more of. Some of the first studies we did with this were for sediment resuspension and transport. So these are some images from a study by Scott Glenn that was published in 2008, but were some of our first deployments. So this is November 2003 on the left and September 2004 on the right. The top is temperature, and then the bottom is optical backscatter. So in the top plot, you can basically see, top left corner, you can see warm ocean temperatures top to bottom, relatively warm, still 15 degrees Celsius. So this is kind of our fall winter conditions. And then you can see this storm came through and we had this massive sediment resuspension event. This is really exciting. It's still exciting today and it was exciting then. But seeing sediment resuspended from like 30 or 40 meters depth all the way to the surface of the ocean through the entire water column. So these big pipelines of sediment moving up during these unstratified conditions. The next year, September 2004, this was actually still kind of in the summertime periods where we had a warm surface ocean and a cold bottom ocean. This is a feature known as the Mid-Atlantic Cold Pool. A hurricane or a tropical cyclone came through, and you can see that sediment coming up, but not being able to penetrate through that stratification, basically being restricted by it. So these are kind of two different storm resuspension responses in our region. This was a very exciting study at the time, but one major limitation is that with an optical backscatter sensor by itself and no chance for any sort of calibration or collecting sediment samples at a glider deployed for a month at a time, you really can just say whether sediment resuspension happened or not. You can't really say anything about the details of it, the particle size distributions, the concentrations. It's very difficult to get at that information. So the next steps we took for this were to include acoustic backscatter. So we have our optical backscatter sensors, which at the time were from Wet Labs, now part of Seabird. And then we added some acoustic sensors from Nortec. We had an Aquadop. This is not the same system here, but we had an Aquadop strapped on top of a glider that we managed to deploy ahead of Hurricane Sandy. So this was the first chapter of my thesis as a graduate student. We managed to get a glider out about 4 days in advance of Hurricane Sandy's forecasted track through the region. And what we got were some pretty cool results. We saw this in the acoustic backscatter. We could actually see somewhat larger particles. The acoustic backscatter is a little more sensitive to the larger particles, where the optical backscatter is more sensitive to the smaller particles. So here you can see that play out. We basically see this big resuspension event right in the middle. There's some contamination from probably bubbles. We had like 10-meter waves and 40 meters of water. So definitely bubbles and kind of mixing up in this upper layer. But then this core sediment resuspension time period. And then things fall back out. These are larger particles. So it's sensitive to the larger particles. So it sees that those particles fall back out a little bit earlier than our optical backscatter. So we see the optical backscatter come up at the same time, but stick around for a little bit longer. So these are probably silts or fine sands that are up in the water column. Again, these 40 meters of water, full water column resuspension. And then the third thing we had on this same system was part of our eco triplet. We were looking at chlorophyll as well. And you can see that there's some sort of nephaloid layer here. This is right where the stratification was, a nephaloid layer that was trapped at the bottom that basically got mixed away. So we saw some high optical backscatter there, but also chlorophyll, and then that's kind of all gone, and you see this local resuspension. So that was the next step. But again, this really only got us, maybe it's a large particle, maybe it's small particles, but not a lot of details to do those detailed sediment particle size distribution studies and really get into the nitty gritty information. So this is about when I started talking with Wayne about developing an integrated list bay, but Yogi Agrawal has been working in this region for a long time, doing some of the early list development work off this area. So this was kind of where we were at when we started talking about putting this project together. We had the original, this was the list 100, I believe, here in the back. We hadn't integrated it up to this point because its power draw was a little bit too high and the system was just a little bit too big for us to fit into a glider science bay. But right when we started developing this idea and a proposal for the Navy, that's when the list 200X came out, which basically had this smaller profile, some lower power consumption, and a bigger particle size range for us to measure. So we had talked about developing this custom instrument for a glider, but when the list 200X came out, we basically took the exact list 200X, repackaged it a little bit, and fit it into a glider science bay like the one you see behind me, and you'll see on some of the next slides. So here it is. It's just a stack-on science bay that fits right into the in line with the glider. So you have the same glider science bay with a CTD and all its other sensors, and this just fits and it makes your glider a little bit longer. So that's a really standard way that we put these together. So a little bit about how this sensor works. Wayne can correct any of my mistakes on this, but generally, this is how the list works and laser diffraction works. So we have our laser source and collimation optics. Then we have our window sample volume, which is what you see right here. And then there is a receiving focusing lens and a ring detector. So basically, as you have your different sizes of particles in this sample volume, you'll get the laser will basically diffract off of those particles, go through this focusing lens and hit a particular ring based on their size. With that data, you can do an inversion that basically determines the amount of each size needed to produce the measured scattering versus angle. The key points here that we can obtain in situ measurements of particle size, total concentration, as well as the 36 different size bins from, I believe it's 1.25 to 500 microns. We're not doing anything super special compared to a regular list and 200X, and the list 200X has been used around the world and in all sorts of different conditions. So I think this is a really cool project where we're taking some established technologies and putting them together into a new use case. So how does that all look packaged up? I just showed you the model back here. Here you can see the schematic on the screen, but basically you have the scattering volume. here, the collimation optics and the reference detector up in this external part. The laser is down in the body of the glider. The receiving lens, the lens tube is down in the body of the glider, and then the ring detectors and the brains of the operation here. It's not the most hydrodynamic looking thing in the world, but we've flown it quite a bit now, and it doesn't seem to have much impact on our performance for flight characteristics. We've put much bigger, more bulky sensors on gliders before and had much more problems with them. So this has been a pretty smooth integration for us. It is located on the top, which is not ideal for shading the instrument or potential light contamination. But it is ideal for mitigating any sort of damage to the system itself when you deploy or recover the system, or from hitting the bottom if we happen to get slammed into the bottom of the ocean. So we've gotten pretty good data off of it, off of the top, and it hasn't seemed to make too much of a difference that it's on there. So this is what we built. Back here's the system. But of course, we have to do some test deployments. So we did our test deployments back. We did a couple in 2017. I'm going to present data from 2019, which I think is one of our best deployments, where we captured some storm resuspension and transport. And so we deployed it in our backyard here off of New Jersey for a 1-month mission along the New Jersey coast. This was leveraged with deployment that we do every year for the Department of Environmental Protection, where they do missions mapping for low oxygen and hypoxia. And they've been a huge supporter of new sensor development and storm research, letting us keep their funded gliders out during those events. So we deploy off Sandy Hook, and we swim south along the New Jersey coast and are eventually recovered off of Atlantic City. But I'm going to focus in on this time period, which is about a 3 or 4 day time period. There's a storm that occurred in here, and we managed to station keep in one position for a few days, just inshore of a Army Corps of Engineer wave buoy. And then we also have this MET station that I'll reference here off Tuckerton, New Jersey, at our field station. A little bit about this region. It's been extensively studied. Some of those early list studies were carried out here. It's basically got a very simple, I don't know, it's simple, but it's got some straightforward optical properties. So it's a good place to test new sensors. We have a sandy bottom with median particle diameters of about 400 microns, though there's a lot of patchiness throughout the region. Generally, they're non-cohesive in this vicinity, sands. So we have river output here at the north and at the south, but kind of central New Jersey, it's mostly just local sands with a unimodal distribution. So the signal's relatively clear to understand, and it makes it a good place to try to see if your instrument's working properly. Here, it's also typically a storm and wave-driven environment. Our transport is generally modified by tidal currents, but our main driver of sediment resuspension is those storms and waves. So it's relatively easy to interpret your forcing as well. So if we zoom in, here's that glider track moving south. This is September 18th. 19th, and then we hold position in this location from the 20th at 0Z to the 21st at 18Z. So if we look at some of our meteorological data, this is our storm event ramping up. So this is the 18th at 0Z all the way to the 21st at 18Z. You can see it ramping up. We get our peak winds kind of midday on the 19th. Wind directions are relatively stable, and then the wave heights peak a little bit later after those winds, and our wave periods are relatively constant, but our wave heights are near 4 meters during this period. So that's a pretty good amount of pretty decent amount of waves to resuspend sediment in our area. Okay, so just looking first at our glider data, what did the environment look like from our CTD? The top left panels, that's temperature, and then we have salinity and density. The black line or white line down here is the estimate of the surface mixed layer depth. And then you can see it's a little bit stratified. It's warm at the surface, 22 degrees C, about 3 degrees of stratification, which is not very much for our region. We can have temperature differences of like 10 degrees Celsius or more in summer here. So we're kind of on the transition from summer into winter, but still a little bit of stratification, both in temperature and in the salinity, which you can see reflected in the density. As the storm comes through, this is what we kind of call this is like the timing of destratification. It's basically warm top to bottom, fresh, not fresh top to bottom, but uniform salinity top to bottom, and then uniform density top to bottom. So we have the stratified period, unstratified period. Storm kind of mixes away that stratification. And then this is our first look at some of the real-time total volume concentrations from the glider. So this is some of the first data that we saw, and we were immediately very excited that we could see this resuspension event right here, right during that unstratified time period, just like we had seen in those past studies. And I don't show it here, but it lines up pretty well with the optical backscatter. This is just total concentration. I'll show things broken apart here in a minute. But there were some immediate things, quality control work that we had to do. Some of these are standard things you have to do with any list, but with some quirks for a glider. So the first thing we noticed was that during these periods where we expected there to be low volume concentrations, we saw low total volume concentrations before the event. And then after the event, we saw a little bit higher. And even as it came out, we saw it kind of increasing a little bit. And this is a result of is that we needed to do background corrections. So basically, if you have a list on a vessel, you want to do those background corrections if you can every cast, zero the sensor out, just in case there's any sort of biofouling or anything that might happen to your optics. You can't really do that with a glider deployed at sea, but we implemented some methods that have been around since about 2015, but that I think are really cool, where you can basically take an in situ value and use that as your background correction. So we found our measurement with the maximum transmission for each glider segment, which happens about every 3 hours. And we use that file with some new Sequoia software, as well as some MATLAB code to basically do a background correction at sea. We did it in post-processing, but it could be possible to do it at sea. This is the transmission measurements without the background correction. So the blue line, you can see it just kind of going off here, and it keeps going. And that's basically potentially biofouling or maybe any sort of micro scratches or anything at the lens. By doing that in situ background correction, we basically got a really good flat line here. And we have some other cool histograms that aren't in here of this. The result of that is you can see that we cleaned up this before and after period to look basically more, this after period looks more like the before period. We also did a little filtering to get rid of potential spurious large particles in here. So that's the first thing we did. The second thing we did is we had to investigate these areas. So our question was there resuspension or some sort of nephaloid layer underneath that stratification, or is this the well-known, I highlighted that in yellow, well-known Schwieren effect? And what we determined is that it was this well-known Schwieren effect, which basically this is micro density changes due to turbulence. I don't know, micro is not an official term. That's just, but basically it's density changes and turbulence at density interfaces. So basically, as you go through the mixed layer, the light is diffracted similar to how large particles might diffract light, just due to those density interfaces. I generally think about this as seeing the heat coming off of on a hot day off of the highway. You can actually kind of see light diffract as you look through that. This is a well-known effect again. In some cases, when you have buoyancy frequencies or exceeding 0.12 in some studies, and there's some other thresholds in other environments, you can, 0.02 is one that we used, you can potentially contaminate your larger size bins. To check this out, we did some correlations between our at each individual size bin with our n squared, which is our n, which is our buoyancy frequency. And we basically started to see correlation with densities and buoyancy frequency in these higher, larger size bins. So to manage this, we looked at our larger size bins and masked them out, and then recalculated our total volume concentration. So here's where we broke it all out. I've just been showing the total volume concentrations. Now I'm showing what we've binned into 4 different size bins. So this is our silts, our less than 64 microns. We have some fine sands, some medium, and some coarse sands. And so 64 to 125 microns, 125 to 250, 250 to 500. What's cool here is that you see this resuspension event in each size bin, but the biggest peak is here in this kind of medium sizes with the, but you see very little in that lower layer here where we saw it in the total volume concentration. Most of that is happening in the larger size bins, which kind of doesn't make any physical sense other than it being Schwieren. We see a little bit here, and this is potentially a little bit of early silts being resuspended below that layer. So when we mask that data out, we end up with a very nice and clean total volume concentration figure up here. So this was very cool. Now we've gone from, like I set up before, we just had large and small particles with the acoustic and optical backscatter and no measures of concentration. Now we can get total volume concentration, we can get mean particle sizes, we can get the concentrations at each of those individual size bins, 36 different size bins, and really get into a ton of detail about what our sediment and particle characteristics are. This is the space that I'm typically working in, is looking at individual profiles of this and trying to understand the physics of the sediment resuspension and transport. Here are profiles sliced out from before the storm event, where you can see, so the blue line is our total volume concentration, the orange is the optical backscatter. You can see them agreeing quite well in their slopes. The blue line is actually in concentration units, whereas optical backscatter is just in a per meter unit. And then the black is the density. So basically, when you have this density stratification, everything's kind of stuck and can't penetrate through that ahead of any storm event. We get our storm event, it mixes away the stratification, and then the waves pick everything up in an almost totally vertical line, top to bottom. And then as the storm starts to recede, it kind of all leans back over as things fall out of suspension. So these are processes we've known about for a long time, we've modeled, but have been very difficult to quantify. So this is very, very cool for me. With this, we can also get actual quantitative estimates of suspended load transport. We pair this up with the depth averaged glider velocities that we can calculate. And we can see that we have this southward transport from the storm. So basically it was blowing, winds were blowing out of, it's a nor'easter, so out of the northeast, and blowing stuff to the south and west throughout the storm. You can see it's modified by some tidal currents here. Yeah, so this is very, very, very cool for that. And then the next step for this, and this was a little bit of a reach for us, but ended up being really exciting, is combining this with some of the other properties, other measurements on the glider that are co-located with it. We were able to get estimates of additional physical properties. Notably, the bottom friction velocities use star, which are really difficult to measure, estimate especially from a glider system, but even with integrated ADCPs. And what's cool about this is we can use this to help evaluate our ocean and sediment transport modeling systems, like the coast system that USGS runs with the community sediment transport model, or even our one-dimensional sediment modeling systems. And something I'm starting to think about in the future is, can we assimilate this data into these modeling systems, or are there other applications for how we might be able to use this? This is really breaking new ground for providing real-time sediment information or particle information that we have not been able to do before. So it's very, very exciting. These are just a few of the applications that I've been focusing on and that are subject to the most recent paper. But we actually built 10 of these sensors for the Navy, and we've been able to loan them out to a number of different partners who have started to do some work with them. So we have partners Donglai Gong at VIMS, Virginia Institute of Marine Sciences. They've flown it out off the Wilmington Canyon, looking at beam attenuation in the Wilmington Canyon. So trying to understand particles in and out of that canyon system. And then we had a partner at UC Davis, and they've deployed one of these systems in Lake Tahoe, which they have some really interesting internal tides, or not internal tides, but internal waves at depth that can actually resuspend sediment and affect the water quality and clarity and some of the ecosystem dynamics in Lake Tahoe. A friend of mine, Felipa Carvalho at National Oceanography Center, and Nathan Briggs have taken a sensor down to the Southern Ocean to try to see if we have enough sensitivity to measure particle flux at deep ocean depths. So at like 600 meters, looking at those depths, which is how far the list is currently rated to. The integrated list is rated to, I think, 600 meters. And then I participated in in a cruise in the Mediterranean with some friends at University of Perpignan in France, and Ifremer and Sephram to deploy a glider in the Rhone River outflow and look at river output and sediment output there. So there's a lot of different studies that are taking off and with different applications beyond just kind of this sediment resuspension transport story that I've put together. So with that, I'd like to wrap up and thank you all for coming. Thank the Oceanography Society for inviting me to give this seminar. I believe it's going to be the first of many. So I put here the information for future webinars at TOS.org/webinar. If you have technical questions, Wayne will definitely try to answer them now, but also feel free to reach out to him via email and others at Sequoia. And then we have this paper I mentioned that's coming out any day now. So look out for that, and maybe we can get a link posted or something once it's out in its full open access form. All right. Any questions? And thank you. And any questions?
Well, thank you very much, Travis. So it's really, really very interesting. And in my second question, I'll come back to why I'm so interested. It has to do with stuff I did 50 years ago. But let me start with a question, maybe for Wayne more than for you. And basically it has to do with my ignorance about gliders. That is, I'm not sure what the power budget on a glider is. There must be some battery packed to it, and you have to do something to drive the buoyancy engine, I assume. How much does the list draw on that, and how much does it lessen the duration or endurance of the glider?
Yeah, I can give you the general. Wayne probably has the specifics on the list power draw itself, but for gliders generally, we typically fly gliders with either lithium rechargeable packs that can last about 40 days or lithium primary packs, which can last for about 3 months. This is always the issue and challenge of integrating new sensors is not only can it fit in your science bay, but what's its energy draw and what's its capacity. The List 200X is actually not the worst out of some of the things we've integrated before. It only cut our power if we operated at full blast, I think, in the full time, maybe by less than a quarter of a full mission. which we have many sensors. Some of the ADCPs can cut our mission by a half, which is a significant reduction. The way we've been operating this is to, we don't have to have the sensor on all the time. So maybe we do 1 or 2 profiles every 3 hours or something like that. And then if a storm comes or an interesting feature comes, you can turn the sampling up in real time and sample much more rapidly. So we haven't seen any real significant impact, as long as we're smart about how we fly it on our missions. It's been very, very successful.
Yeah, I'd just add to that, one of the things with the development of the LIS glider is we did rework the electronics a bit so that we could essentially give full control to the glider as far as whether it would start up the instrument, how it would set the sampling rate, because the instrument takes much more power when it's sampling versus when it's idle. About a watt or so when it's sampling, and then probably 8 milliamps at 12 volts or something like that when it's just idle. So it really gives a lot of flexibility to the mission.
Great. I see a comment in the chat by Moritz. And Moritz, maybe you want to just turn your microphone on and kind of let everybody know about that. It's kind of an exciting application. I see your microphone on, but we're not hearing you, Moritz. So.
No?
There you go.
Yeah, sorry, that was my Bluetooth headphones, the interview. Yeah, I was saying I'm working at Oregon State University, and one thing that we want to tackle next is integrating the LIS 200X with our optical imaging system that we tow behind ships. So with that imaging system, we get really good representation of plankton and jellies and even larval fish, range 200 micron to 20 centimeters. So we wanted something where we can increase our ability to look at smaller things as well. So with the 200X, obviously, we're going to be able to tackle that. And we have also that overlapping range where we can calibrate the 2 instruments. So, using those 2 instruments, we think we can tackle some really interesting size spectra questions. And so I think that what you just showed in the presentation was really interesting with regards to the different size fractions, because we're hoping to get at that kind of data as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of what we're doing here with our data processing is very similar to doing things with a shipboard instrument. There's very, very few changes we had to make, I think, to get to some good results. So hopefully we can continue to learn from each other and on these different strategies for different platforms.
Cool. I might hit you up once we want to process some data.
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you.
The questions from anybody else? Just chime in or raise your hand or throw it into the chat. But I think we're a small enough group that we can just chime in. In the meantime, I'm going to come back to my 50-year-old question because what excited me so much about this is the last time I thought about resuspension and sediment was as a graduate student almost 100 years ago. But actually, really, I sat down and calculated. It really was almost 50 years ago, and that's really scary. And that was in the old Hubble experiments. And now we're working when we were working in 5,000 meters of water and looking at benthic boundary layer issues. And there, the forcing for the resuspension, of course, was coming from the bottom up. Although, to be honest, we actually, at some of our landings, did see indications of passing storms above, 5,000 meters deep, which was really quite remarkable. There was actually a science paper about that. And what you're showing, it's the inverse. So, I assume the forcing is coming from the air-sea interface and driving things downwards. So the forcing function is diminishing with depth. And I'm wondering if there is, and again, it's just my own ignorance, are there any processes that actually start more resembling what's going on in the benthic boundary layer, where you're actually creating a bottom forcing phenomena that's resuspending the sediment, not just the diminished forcing of orbital wave motion or something as you come down to the bottom. Is there some bottom phenomena going on?
Yeah, there's some parallels to kind of your history and story here. I've been working with Scott Glenn for the last 10 years on this work, but he's been working on sediment resuspension and linear wave theory and looking at bottom boundary layers, probably as long as you've the same amount of time. And this has been really exciting because we've been able to see some things that were just theory in his master or his PhD thesis, right around these topics with the list, looking at the actual concentrations and getting at those U stars and shear stresses. And what it really is in this particular environment is that we get in that wave bottom boundary layer, as those orbital velocities get close to the bed, the orbitals actually flatten out and they end up being back and forth rather than in a circular motion. And so we're still getting really high shear stresses from those orbital velocities, even though the atmospheric forcing is diminishing as you go through the water column. We're still getting really high orbital velocities at the bed, even in 40, 50 meters of water. We have some measurements with just a optical backscatter sensor off of Jeju Island, South Korea during a typhoon, and saw in 100 meters of water what looked like that actual wave bottom boundary layer dynamics. So that's one property. The other potential properties that could be doing this are looking at, in this relatively shallow water, looking at Langmuir cells in recirculation or Langmuir circulation. There have been studies by Anne Gargett and others that have shown full water column Langmuir supercells that can actually do some of this type of work of resuspending sediment. It's very difficult to pick those out with a glider just because of the wavelengths and things like that. But there's processes like that, as well as some other sub-mesoscale processes that we could be looking at to try to understand this in our region. There's been some other studies. I'd like to deploy one of these off of near some of the shelf breaks, continental shelf breaks, where you can actually get internal waves that will come in from offshore, impact the shelf break and cause sediment resuspension. So we saw some of that off of the escarpment off the Gulf of Mexico with some glider deployments and ADCP deployments, but not with a list. The cool thing is what's always been a little bit of our nemesis is that, like, even if we can see it, if we don't have the measures of the particle size or concentration, it's very difficult to understand like how much stress is there or is required, or we know the physics pretty well. We just don't have the observations to confirm that what we're seeing is this kind of bottom boundary layer resuspension or getting the right U stars, things like that. So being able to explore that is very, very exciting. And it's kind of, for Scott, it's very full circle on where he started with his PhD thesis.
Fantastic. And I'll refer you to a paper probably 45 years ago by Roger Flood, visiting a series of furrows. I think it was off Lake Bahama Outer Ridge with Trieste and falling back on Langmuir circulation, Langmuir type cells for the explanation. Ola.
Yeah, cool. Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Travis. That was a phenomenal presentation. I thought that's pretty cool stuff. I have a more general question. Is there since coming from an instrumentation point of view, is there a dream measurement or a dream parameter that you would like to measure that you can't measure that yet?
Yeah, I think so. The way I kind of walked through earlier in the presentation is we went from optical backscatter and then acoustic backscatter. We've added, now we can get the particle sizes and the concentrations, but we also did this deployment in a very simple environment, like I presented, with just where we kind of know the bottom type is sandy sediment. I think the things that we really still need to be able to get at, and what I think my colleagues are going to have challenges with in some of these riverine environments or offshore environments, is particle characteristics. So understanding whether we have a flocculate, or whether understanding what the sediment type is, if it's not sand, trying to understand if it's muds or other biological materials. I think all of those, color, shape, all of those characteristics, I think are going to be things that are kind of the next questions. I think the list hollow is an interesting option for that. I think there's still a lot of questions about how we would integrate it and how you would manage the large amounts of data. But I think there's also some exciting progress just in general for onboard processing and for artificial intelligence to figure out how we can deal with maybe large volumes of data on board the glider and just send back the important parts of what you need. So I see that as kind of the frontier area for these types of technology combinations. And I think what's great is that there's a healthy development of methods and technology for your shipboard measurements with these systems. The list hollow has been around. Some of these other sensors, optical imaging sensors, have been around, and the gliders have been around. And so it's just how can we feed back that development into these autonomous platforms? I think that's kind of a healthy place to work.
Daniel.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. My name is Dan. I'm with RBR, and we're really pleased to support Travis and Rutgers, and as well as Sequoia, and participate in this seminar. So thanks, everyone, very, very much for this. It's been really good. Just a simple question, and I know you talked about some of the practicalities of the actual installation of the Sequoia sensor in terms of maintenance and recovery. And
camera's not on. I'm on mute too.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Oh,
Maybe.
sorry.
Yeah.
Apologies. Could you talk about if the turbulence from the actual glider motion creates bubbles or other types of things that impact the readings from this particular sensor?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that, we haven't done any CFD type modeling or anything of this particular setup. That's kind of outside of our capacity, but I know Rockland Scientific has done a lot of that type of modeling for their microstructure profilers for different glider body shapes and turbulent boundary layers. And I think the Slocum itself has a pretty minimal impact on the just cylindrical shape of it. Actually has a pretty minimal impact until you get toward that tail section with the cone and the shape of that in the aft section. You get some stagnation areas. So there's some pretty good research from Rockland on that. There was nothing obvious in our data. I would have expected to see some sort of contamination in the consistently, basically, if it was glider flight oriented contamination. And I would have expected to see that when we were in a low wave, low current environment, just doing our regular swimming. And we really didn't see anything crop up. There was the occasional large particle that we had to filter out, and it's difficult to know whether that was some sort of eddy feature that came off the glider body or whether it was actually a large particle. So maybe that's something worth looking at, right? If we see those features in our 600-meter dives in the Southern Ocean, that may be a culprit. So it's something to consider. But yeah, compared to some other sensors we've had, I think the way the window size and kind of the open space here seems pretty good. We've had some other sensors with more of just like a tube where data is supposed to come in, where it hasn't been quite so successful. We had a fire sensor, a Satlantic fire sensor with like a tube coming out, and trying to push water through that hole is really difficult if it's not designed for it. So yeah, I know you guys have thought a lot about this with the shape of the RBR concerto as well. Which I think it has maybe a similar profile to the list, but actual design, to funnel water through there. So yeah.
Cool. I was just curious. Thanks very much.
Yep. Great to see you.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks.
Maybe I can follow up again with probably a question out of ignorance with respect to the list itself, and it goes back to Ola's question about what your dream measurements would be. And you mentioned more characterization of the particles beyond their size. I don't know if the list makes a spherical assumption? Does it
Mhm.
give any insight into the shape of the particle itself? So I'm trying to think about what the trade-offs would be between new sensors, which are really difficult, and pushing on the AI machine learning side in terms of the information you have, which is also difficult, but may not be the leap of a new sensor.
I'll let Wayne speak to this more broadly for this particular study. So basically, we made some assumptions, and with the algorithms, you can pick your algorithm and basically make your assumptions about the shapes. We're not actually measuring the shapes. For this particular study, I believe we used assumed a random shape distribution, and Wayne and the guys at Sequoia probably know all the details on the different options. So Wayne, you want to answer that one?
Yeah, basically the end of the answer is we don't get any shape information out of the list measurement. We do use a matrix or an inversion assumption that allows for the particles to be randomly shaped, but they're basically randomly shaped and randomly oriented. So there's no idea of shape information that you get out of it. The other way of doing the laser diffraction inversion would be to assume that they're spherical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I mean, I think Wayne, with the list hollow, there's possible, right? You basically measure it, so you could see what those shapes are, and then, right?
Yeah, with the hollow, you get images of particles within the sample
Yeah.
volume. So then you can do sort of general image processing and figure out, are they more spherical? Are they elongated particles? You could even try to examine the images and classify them as different types of things.
Yeah. I'm imagining a great combo would be like, I mean, not as an engineer, but just as a user, is you have like a list hollow and a list 200X on the same system, and the list 200X picks up a measurement and fires off the hollow, and you get an image of what you measured with the 200X like at the same time without having to do the full hollow processing, or something like that, where you can get those images at the same time as the more continuous lower power measurements.
Yeah, we've definitely thought about, if we were to do the hollow on a glider, ways like that to allow it to be more dynamic in the way it samples, so that you're not overwhelmed with data volume and use too much power.
Yeah.
Okay, we're coming onto the top of the hour, and so I think we have to bring this to an end. But I want to thank you both. I want to thank Travis particularly for the seminar, and Wayne for the support you provided. You've certainly set a very high bar for future seminars in terms of quality and interest. I think it's very relevant stuff. So thank you. And I'm sure if any folks have more questions to either Travis or Wade, the email addresses are up there, or you can always get in contact with Jenny at the Oceanography Society.
Yeah, I just also want to thank TOS for putting this on. This has been a great opportunity, and in the industry, you don't always have the opportunity to be involved with this sort of thing, and to see our original proposal go from technology development to a science question, and have it summarized here and get to talk about it. So this was great.
No, I'm quite excited about this.
Yeah,
this
I look forward to the future.
Yep.
Future seminars.
Okay, thank you all, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Cheers.
thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Take care.
Thank you, Larry.